Hi everyone and welcome back. Hope you're all doing well and staying safe. With the current season paused for the foreseeable future, I thought it'd be interesting to look at the past instead. Specifically at some of the details many of us have probably forgotten, and maybe even some newer fans might not even know. I'm going to start with something I had to remind myself of recently, which was who was actually on the starting grid for Lewis Hamilton's first race. Hamilton's first race was of course back in 2007 at the Australian Grand Prix for McLaren. He was coming in as a 2006 GP2 champion with ART and was held in very high esteem by McLaren team principal Ron Dennis. He beat out Pedro de la Rosa and Gary Paffett for the seat to partner the defending world champion Fernando Alonso, who of course at the time was racing for McLaren for the very first time in their very first season together. The pair replaced the outgoing Kimi Raikkonen, who was off to Ferrari, and Juan Pablo Montoya, who was leaving the sport completely. But let's have a look at who else was on the grid that day. At the back of the grid, we had Felipe Massa, who was a surprise entry in the Ferrari. He had a sloppy Q2 placement that day and found himself in 16th, but then all that was compounded with an engine change to stick him at the back of the grid. He did have an admirable fight back in the race to achieve 6th place though. Next up we had Christian Albers racing for the Spiker in their first and only full season. He chose to start from the pit lane and would go on to be the first man to retire in the race after only 10 laps. Next on the grid was his teammate in the other Spiker, Adrian Sutil. Sutil would go on to finish the race in 17th place, which sadly for him made him last of the running cars. Although he went on to have a decent career, so I'm pretty sure he's not too sad about that. In 19th place was Vitantonio Liuzzi, driving for the Toro Rosso. This was Liuzzi's second and final year at Toro Rosso, who still had a very revolving door at this time, as we'd go on to see with the other driver as well. He'd go on to finish the race in 14th place. In 18th we had David Coulthard, who at this point was winding down his legendary career, still with Red Bull. He'd gone to retire from the race on lap 48 after a nasty collision with Alexander Wurz. In 17th we had the other Toro Rosso and its American driver Scott Speed. This would be Speed's final season in F1 after falling out with the team. Apparently he wasn't too happy that the team were trying to replace him with some German kid named Sebastian Vettel. I wonder what happened to that guy. Anyway, Speed ended up crashing out of the race on lap 17. In 16th it was Rubens Barrichello, who was in the midst of his mighty career at this point and still racing for Honda. He'd go on to improve that poor qualifying and finish in 11th place. In 15th we had Alexander Wurz in his one and only season at Williams. It was actually Wurz's first full season as an F1 driver since 2000, and his career behind the scenes has been much more prevalent than actually in the racing seat. He also retired following that collision with David Coulthard. Next up we have Jenson Button in 14th, who is still one of my favourite drivers of all time. He would be a couple years off his World Championship at this point, but he was racing for the familiar Honda team, but only managed to finish 15th in the race after receiving a drive-through penalty after speeding in the pit lane. In 13th was Heikki Kovalainen, who was another driver making his debut in Australia. He was replacing the outgoing Fernando Alonso at Renault. He ended up finishing the race in 10th, which sounds pretty good for a rookie in his first race, but at the time Renault considered this result poor because they expected to be challenging for championships. Another one-time champion to come was in 12th place with Nico Rosberg, who's only in his second season in the sport so far and would go on to finish an impressive 7th place. In 11th was Anthony Davidson, who, while having some races the year before, was entering his first full season as an F1 driver racing for Super Aguri. Unfortunately, his race didn't go great he finished in 16th place after stalling on the grid and then colliding with Adrian Sutil. In 10th was Davidson's teammate Takuma Sato, impressively getting into Q3 in the Super Aguri. Sadly, he didn't manage to transition that impressive qualifying performance into the race, eventually finishing 12th. In 9th, we have Ralf Schumacher, brother of legendary Michael, of course, racing in his final season in F1 for the Toyota team. He managed to improve his qualifying position in the race, finishing 8th and securing one of his 5 total points he'd achieved that season. Next up, we have Schumacher's teammate Jarno Trulli, 1 place ahead of him in 8th. Trulli was 10 years into his veteran career at this point and would continue to race with Toyota despite a disappointing season. He finished the race in 9th, 1 place behind his teammate and 1 place outside the points. In 7th was Mark Webber, who was in his first race for Red Bull at this point, replacing Christian Klein. He ended up finishing the race in 13th place after several mechanical issues on his car. In 6th, we had the other Renault belonging to Giancarlo Fisichella, who became the number 1 driver after Alonso departed, who'd gone to finish the race in 5th place, eventually leaving the team at the end of the season for Force India. In 5th, we have another familiar face, Robert Kubica, who was into his first full season as F1 driver for the BMW Sauber team. He retired from this race after a gearbox issue meant he couldn't continue. In 4th place, it's the man himself, it's Lewis Hamilton, who had a strong first race, keeping pace with the leading drivers at the time and even leapfrogged 3rd place at the pit stops to claim the podium place for himself. And of course, successfully beginning one of the greatest F1 careers of all time. In 3rd, it's the man Hamilton passed for his podium, it's Nick Heidfeld, who eventually ended in 4th with his BMW Sauber and would go on to have a really strong season himself. Next up in 2nd, we had the reigning world champion, Fernando Alonso, obviously, as I pointed out earlier, racing for McLaren for the first time. He had a very strong race, finishing in 2nd as well, although this season would go down in infamy due to the relationship troubles that would arise between Alonso and McLaren. And finally, we have our man on pole, and the man who would go on to win the race and win the championship as well. It's Kimi Raikkonen. There's not much more to say about him there. He would only go on to win by 1 point from both Hamilton and Alonso in the championship. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed that. That was a rundown of everybody on the grid for Lewis Hamilton's first race in Formula 1 in 2007, qualifying and finishing positions as well. So I hope that was a fun trip down memory lane for you guys. I certainly enjoyed doing this one. It was really fun to research this information, so I had a lot of fun. If there's anything you guys want me to look at specifically, let me know in the comments, and of course I'll get around to it. But for now, I'll catch you in the next one.